Christian, du trøtt av å pumpe?
Nei, Melius, jeg redd. Det begynner å bli så mørkt.
Ok da, la oss løpe hjem.
The youthful organist was Frederick Melius Christiansen, practicing in the gathering dusk, while his younger brother pumped the bellows. A year later, 14-year-old Melius became church organist when his teacher left Larvik to study in Leipzig. Immersed in music from childhood, it has been said of F. Melius Christiansen that music was the thread on which his family beaded their days. Inspired by the lullabies, dance tunes, and Lutheran hymns of his youth, this young musician from rock-ribbed, fjord-pierced Norway would one day become an American music master. His choral conducting and songs would set a standard for a cappella choirs that would change American church music forever. This is the story of an old world heritage, shaped and enlarged by the free, wide ways and deep soul hunger of the new. Referring to the musical culture of his homeland, F. Melius Christiansen would later say, "Norway gave me much, but America taught me how to use it." Born in 1871 in Eidsvoll, Norway, home of Norwegian independence, F. Melius Christiansen was playing a three-key clarinet by age 3. By age 6, he was in his father's band in Larvik. His days were filled with practice on violin, cornet, and piano, and he made his solo debut on his chosen instrument, the violin, at the age of 14. 3 years later, he decided to join his brother in America, finally settling in the flourishing lumber town of Washburn, Wisconsin. Here was the America of Carnegie, Morgan, the Rockefellers, of William Dean Howells, Henry James, and the New York Philharmonic. Even Washburn had its own Scandinavian band, directed by Melius' brother Carl.
I think a point can be proven that one man can make a difference. F. Melius Christiansen came to the United States as a young man, a teenager in fact, from Larvik, Norway. He came with the desire to make a better life for himself and to have a musical career which he knew would not happen in Norway.
Christiansen directed the community band in Marinette, where he also became a church organist and choir director. A visit by the Augsburg College Male Quartet attracted Christiansen to Augsburg in 1892, a move which he considered to be the turning point in his life. Now an American citizen and in much demand as a violinist, he became known as the Ole Bull of Augsburg. He began composing and directed a student chorus. He enrolled in the Northwestern Conservatory of Music, studying violin and piano, harmony and counterpoint. Minneapolis of the 1890s was bursting with music, with a string quartet and orchestra, visiting opera companies, music festivals, and 52 recognized choruses. Into this atmosphere, Christiansen brought his skill with violin and his growing talent for composition. Playing, teaching, and conducting, in addition to his work as a church choir director and organist, and his marriage to Edith Lindum in 1897, kept him very busy. He organized a mixed chorus and published a choir book, followed by a monthly bulletin for church choirs.
In Leipzig, Germany, where there was a famous conservatory, and he went there as a young man. And one of the people he studied was the director of the Thomaner Choir, which was the choir that Bach had conducted. It had a long tradition, and it consisted of boys and men. Many people think that he enjoyed the purity of the boys' voices and that he wanted these in women's voices.
When he studied in Germany, of course, he studied with Schreck. And Schreck was the choir director in Bach's church. And so that he really got inspired there for choral music.
On his return to America, Christiansen again became a church organist, joined the violin department of Northwestern Conservatory, directed a choral club, and played violin with the Philharmonic Orchestra. Then, in the summer of 1903, Christiansen was called to start a music department at St. Olaf College in Northfield, a small town south of Minneapolis. He was to direct band and chorus, teach violin and theory, and take over the student chorus called the Choral Union, all at a salary of $600 a year. He forged a good band, took it on tour, and in 1906 toured Norway, landing in Oslo with his band playing both the Star-Spangled Banner and Ja, vi elsker dette landet, the Norwegian national anthem. Returning to St. Olaf after further study in Leipzig, Christiansen turned the band over to a colleague and shifted his focus to choral music. In one early sign of his demand for excellence, the St. Olaf College newspaper reported, "Members of the Choral Union declare it is essentially a labor organization."
The St. Olaf Choir began as an outgrowth of the St. John's Lutheran Church Choir here in Northfield. And it was as Christiansen and then President John Kildall were developing a series of song services. In fact, little hymn festivals in which the choir would sing Christiansen settings of the great hymns, and Kildall would weave the texts of those hymns into little vignettes and little homilies. And in 1912, when they took their first big tour to Wisconsin, the name of the choir was then changed from the St. John's Lutheran Choir to the St. Olaf Lutheran Choir.
Here was the official beginning of the choir that was to help shape American choral music standards. By 1920, Christiansen and his family, wife Edith, and children Jake, Olaf, Carl, Paul, and Elsa, were firmly rooted in their home on St. Olaf Avenue. Today, a pine F. Melius brought as a sapling from Norway still flourishes.
I still remember hearing those sounds downstairs, the piano. And he gave violin lessons. I remember listening to that too. So it kind of got into my skin unconsciously, sounds. And so when I got a little older, I started fiddling at the piano myself, of course. And that's when Dad started teaching me to write music down, what I was playing. So those were actually the great memories of Northfield, were those musical sounds, how they crept into my life and stayed there.
The home filled with music seemed to rub off on two sons and cure another. Olaf would succeed his father at St. Olaf, and Paul would go on to establish another fine college choir at Concordia. Son Jake, a successful football coach, once tried conducting his brother Paul's choir.
When I raised my arms up like that, and then they started to sing, and then all I did was this. And that wasn't hard to do.
Sung chorus by the St. Olaf Lutheran Choir, directed by F. Melius Christiansen. Dr. Christiansen is receiving a tremendous ovation from the audience.
Professionally, F. Melius Christiansen and the St. Olaf Choir began to be fixed in America's musical consciousness.
Christiansen's contribution was that he took the sacred literature, really meant and seen as exclusively designed for worship experiences and the church, and he elevated that repertoire to a level in which it could then be presented in the finest concert halls of the nation.
The big tour that put the choir on a more of a national basis was the one to the East Coast in 1920. My mother-in-law was actually in that choir, and she remarks that they had small crowds on the way out to New York, and then the big reviews came in, and on the way back, the crowds had swollen, and they had packed houses from there on, and that became very much the norm.
We all traveled by train, and when we took off for a tour that year, it was a southern tour. a small train with about 2 passenger cars was standing at the railroad station in Northfield, and we'd bring our suitcases on there, and that was a kind of a special privilege. And it was always kind of enjoyable passing by Christy and Olaf, and then sometimes conversing with them. And usually Christy had a cigar in his mouth and smoke all around him and so on.
Of the St. Olaf Choir, one critic wrote, "From the moment that Dr. Christiansen let fall his baton, the audience realized they were different from the rest."
It was so perfect, as perfect as human beings of that age can be, as singers can be.
Church music was not at a very high level, I don't think, in the turn of the century. The hymns were sentimental, and this was rather popular with people. And he felt that the choral was the kind of congregational song that should be encouraged. Many of his early pieces, including Beautiful Savior and Built on a Rock and Praise to the Lord, were choral developments of these chorales. Many of them were in 8 parts and rather complicated pieces and very demanding.
He could be nasty and mean, but it wasn't that he didn't love you, it's because he loved the music more. And I remember one time in conducting him saying, "Some people would say this is too hard for the choir. I say it's too hard for the director."
And I can still remember the look in his eyes in certain delicate passages. And I think that carried over to the kids, you know, like it did to me. And that's what made him famous, I think, is that he directed an ordinary hymn, but it became something special when he directed it.
And when we sing a song, it means that we wash. We wash out and shake out our inner self and hang it in the wind. Now, when we sing, we'll have to shake ourselves and get into a different mood than just hang down in our seats. We ought to sit up in our seats and sing when we are called to, on for singing.
The abiding question about Christiansen's methods was a simple one. How does he do it?
Well, the man was a genius and was able to use the colors that he had determined then from the orchestra and put them into the choir.
He was so interested in sound because, of course, he played violin, played piano, he played organ, and he played, when he was 6 years old, he played clarinet in the Larvik band. So he was just interested in colors. I think he got it from instruments. And then he wanted voices to have some beauty of tone and subtleties that an instrument could do.
He knew what he wanted in terms of the sound and the balance of things. And some years later, he indicated in a statement that he felt that they had revived some older principles of ensemble singing that he felt had been lost, probably particularly in this country. And that involved no vibrato in the voices in order to have better intonation.
Christiansen closely studied the physics of sound and the mechanics of the human voice. Careful tryouts tested both ear and voice, as well as strength of personality.
No, the first encounter I had with F. Melius, or Christy as we all called him, was in tryouts. And it was a kind of a scary time. And he would run through have you sing some general notes, but then he'd give you a complicated set of notes to sing, and that was rather difficult.
And then if you did well, you got a recall, and then you went in with several people from the same section to see how the voices would match up.
The Christiansens were always looking for what they called innate talent, And that had to do with how quick the ear could respond to musical ideas. That was what they always tested for. And if they felt that there was someone who had that quality, then they felt that they probably could teach them how to sing.
And that was an interesting time in the recalls, as they called them. And there he would stick his head between singers in order to test out how the intonation would occur, and blending. I think he was very interested in making sure the voices blended with each other.
For sopranos, Christiansen sought a small, thin sound he called reedy, blended with brilliant-toned, fluty voices. Altos needed a darker, cello-like tone. Basses were required to sing a low D without, as Christiansen put it, scraping the bottom of the kettle. Tenors were tested by an interval of a sixth, and their ability to reach high A or B flat without falsetto.
I think he chose voices that were going to blend. You know, if you had a voice that was really individualistic, you wouldn't probably get in the choir. And there were some like that.
Christiansen often told his choirs, "You cannot sing unless you have a love of singing in your hearts." Above all, he insisted that a great choir was, in his words, we, not I.
F. Melius comes across to me as a very simple man, a man who really was not in the business of bringing glory to himself, but really of elevating something that had a profound influence on his life, and that is the art of music.
If you can stand to see that someone else is honored beside yourself, and you will be a happy man.
Preferring 40 voices for his choir, Christiansen finally settled on 60 to enable more dramatic crescendo and majestic climaxes. The choir rehearsed 5 days each week during the academic year, with sectional rehearsals as well.
The rehearsals always began by you coming into the room and Christy at the piano playing one of the pieces that we were going to rehearse right at the very beginning. So if you were the only person in the room, you'd have to start singing your part, no matter what. So there was no waste of time whatsoever.
Strategic placement of singers strengthened Christiansen's ensemble, achieving maximum tonal blend and vocal balance. An inner choir made up of thin, light, even voices, needed for delicate passages of absolute purity, was surrounded by heavier, darker voices. Through these contrasts, Christiansen achieved the artistic effects that became his trademark.
You might say that what Christy became known for was the inner voices, as well as the extremes, the second bass and the sopranos. And it was said that Eugene Ormandy, when he was conducting the Minneapolis Symphony, learned the value of inner voices from listening to the St. Louis Choir.
Well-built, broad-shouldered, and square-jawed with piercing blue eyes, Christiansen was a commanding presence as a conductor. His musical stature might be intimidating, but Christy was also known for his humor.
We had a young woman who was a mezzo-soprano, and it was a very beautiful voice, a lush, warm voice. And her personality had much of this character also, and he got all red and beamed, and he stood up, and he walked over to her and said, "You have sin in your voice," and laughed.
Well, the choir, he said, is singing along, and of course he had this broad Norwegian accent. You are singing along like a wagon that's running on only 3 wheels, and the other part is going and so on. It would drop down.
Paul told Dad a story, and we were having pea soup for supper, and the pea soup flew all over the room because he had triggered that humor in FM. And I feel that kind of spark, whatever that is, that in a humor as well as the serious intensity that both were capable of, is what made their directing so exciting.
There's a girl standing here that directed a concert in Oslo, and I had smoked too many cigars. I stand here and direct, and all of a sudden I see that face. Well, I love that feat. He did a great job. Although some are getting older, and I'm not so very pretty myself any longer.
Christiansen's directing style was undramatic but precise. He was crisp and sparing with his left hand, motioning precisely and economically with his baton hand.
So he was great for facial expressions. In conducting, he wanted you to learn your conducting so it would fit in a little box in front of your face. Let the face do a lot of the work.
The mystery of the audiences was the delayed attack. Somehow there was some kind of symbiosis among the choir members that when he just shook his fist like that you just knew come in all at the same time. Somehow it always worked, and he loved to do that and always surprised audiences, this delayed attack.
Choosing music for the choir, Christiansen said, was one of the most demanding and time-consuming tasks any choral conductor faced. Constantly looking for new material for the choir, he searched music libraries and publishing houses at home and abroad. Drawn to the folk song for its simplicity, he also used a range of European composers and his own compositions, numbering over 600.
The first position I had was in a small Presbyterian school in North Carolina. And I walked into the rehearsal room, and there was a large cupboard for music. I started pulling out pieces, and one after the other was St. Olaf Choir series. It showed to me that this influence of the choir had spread all over the country, even tiny schools and churches and places where you might not expect it to be.
His unified concert programs grouped music in 3 sections, contrasting majestic with lyric and light, and starting and closing strongly. Eventually, audiences came to anticipate one hymn as the choir's signature piece, Christiansen's arrangement of Beautiful Savior.
I think the first print of that was in 1907 with a Norwegian text. It became the first of F. Melius's list of compositions, his own arrangement, at Augsburg Publishing House in 1919. The first 50 in that were arrangements of other composers, and number 51, which was Beautiful Savior. This became then the list of some 250 compositions of F. Melius that were published over those next years.
Beautiful Savior would always appear in the program. Audiences, I think, expected to have an encore of that one, for sure.
Christiansen gradually reduced his teaching hours, and in 1941, he requested that his son Olaf be called from Oberlin to be his assistant.
When Oli was about 5 years old, I took him downtown, bought him a milkshake, and he stood there drinking for quite a while on that. I noticed that Oli started to cry. And I said, what's the trouble? Oh, he says, you paid for it and I can't drink it all. It shows that he wanted his father's money's worth. And that's what he's doing with the choir now, too.
Olaf took the baton in 1943. By then, the immigrant boy from Norway had revolutionized American choral music. Christiansen's choral schools, begun in 1935, continued into the 70s and attracted many conductors and composers from around the country.
What perhaps continues is that the model of the St. Olaf Choir is the clarity of pitch and clarity of rhythm, balance of ensemble.
The great thing about F. Melius's work and the legacy in many ways is that at St. Olaf, at Concordia, at Luther, we've been able to take the greatness of that standard of excellence, and we've created many opportunities not only in our own school communities, but we've encouraged that this be taken out into the world.
Over the years, hundreds of students have had the opportunity to participate in concerts in America's greatest halls before large audiences. Today, the St. Olaf Christmas Festival is attended by thousands and broadcast nationwide.
The Christmas Festival probably was an outgrowth of Christmas programs that perhaps had been at St. Olaf from the very beginning, but we hear that the first ones come somewhere around 1912. Eventually it became more and more centered on the St. Olaf choir.
For Christie, I think the Christmas festival was meant to be a very religious program. He did not want applause or anything like that. It was originally intended for the college family to celebrate Christmas.
On his 80th birthday in 1951, Christiansen received congratulations from Leopold Stokowski, who wrote, "The whole world is indebted to you for what you have done for American choral music. You have taught the church to sing," said a writer at the Lutheran Herald. Added music critic John Sherman, "What he built became part of our permanent cultural heritage."
His attention to nuance of phrasing, to beauty of tone, to the wonderful revelation of the union of text and music, all these things which have characterized the work of F. Melius Christiansen and his sons are things that still continue to influence our work here at St. Olaf, and that way continue to be a living tribute to his work.
"I am not sentimental when I say that the spiritual condition is important in this work," Christiansen once wrote to a colleague. "The spirit of art is very much like the spirit of Christ. Here, too, truthfulness is essential if art is to reach the hearts of listeners." Until his death in 1955, Christiansen continued to strive for that ideal. What he left was a cornerstone of contemporary American choral music, a legacy of technical excellence and artistic interpretation that continues to be passed on to new generations of choral conductors and singers.
We have this wonderful opportunity to bring about this wonderful marriage of text and music. We take someone else's ideas, we spend time with it, and we recreate something even more beautiful in a way because it has a part of each member of the choir contributing to the whole. You know, I think in many ways that's what we hope of life, that we come into this world, we add something, and we turn out something a bit more beautiful than we started with.
I, as conductor of this choir for many years, have been a lucky man. There aren't many people who have had such a wonderful life as I have had here at St. Olaf College. Time changes everything, and we change us too. We get older and older, and it's too bad, isn't it? But how sweet are these faces. They have been bathed in music and beautiful sounds and been cleansed in the art by purity and ideals of the art and music.
I asked him, I said, "Dr. Christiansen, where do you get the inspiration to write all this music?" He looked at me and his eyes twinkled. He said, "I don't write the music." He said, "The angels sing it to me, and I just write it down."
Everything has an end. I almost feel like a ghost that is standing up here to listen to the choir. And I feel that they are thriving and are doing so well.